think both our welfare system and the culture that we have now incentivizes people to say they're ill, and there is a problem with that. I think it feeds into the kind of, this is part of a broader picture of sort of generally the infantilization of young people. They're living at home longer, they can't buy property, they're not having children, they're not forming long-term relationships. I mean, it's all going wrong for this generation. We've gone past destigmatizing mental health issues a lot of the time and gone towards glamourising them. I think it's a real problem.
Good morning. Every day at just after 9 a.m. here on Times Radio, we discuss the big stories of the morning. Today we can speak to the deputy editor of the House Magazine Sienna Rodgers. Good morning.
Good morning.
And the Times columnist Harry Wallop. Morning, Harry.
Good morning.
Here are some of the stories we've covered so far this morning on Times Radio Breakfast. Teenagers who are claiming PIP benefits of £194 a week receive double the amount of money than if they were to work part-time on the minimum wage. Hamish Faulkner told us he was worried about younger people not getting into work early on in life.
Is the system creating bad incentives for young people to not get into work and not take the steps that they need to launch themselves into working life? That is exactly the issue that we're focused on.
So you think there are some negative incentives here?
I do know that there are an increasing number of young people on PIP, and what really worries me, and I see it in my own constituency, is when young people don't get into work early in their life, it often gets much harder to get into work later in life.
That was Hamish Faulkner, the Europe Relations Minister.
We've also been talking about whether the UK should introduce compulsory voting, something Andy Burnham's senior advisors have looked at. Dr David Klemperer from the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath supports compulsory voting, told us how it would work.
It's a new duty to vote, so every registered voter would be obliged to participate in elections or to provide a valid excuse. And the Electoral Commission would be responsible for enforcing that. So the way it works in Australia is that if you don't vote, you receive a message from the Electoral Commission, a notice, which says that it notices that you haven't voted and asks you either to provide an excuse or to pay a small fine.
And we've also been talking about a run club called Run to Wine, which I'm trying to work out if there's a pun in there. I don't think there is. It's just run. It does what it says on the tin. Run to wine.
But the drink rather than complaining.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Right. Yeah. I can see. Run and have a... Okay, got that. Where members run 5 kilometres to meet a bottle of wine at the end of their exertions. The club's founder, Katie Brooke, told us that adding the wine incentive help people socialise.
It really breaks down all the barriers. You all go and get a bit sweaty on a 5k, you all start talking to each other and you make friends, and you get to the wine bar and you're all suddenly on this lovely level playing field. No one's snobbery, there's no snobbery about wine at all. Everyone's kind of in the same boat and they're all just ready to learn a little bit about wine and have a glass together.
I'm probably dehydrated as well, I can imagine. We're going to ask then in the next half an hour, should voting be compulsory? Should female inmates be released early to solve Britain's prison crisis? And which locations are not acceptable to work remotely from? Let's start, though, with what we're talking about. Why work doesn't seem to be working for young people. The Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, says he might increase the conditions on people required to receive benefits, but where might he look? The Times has revealed this morning that some young people can receive twice as much in income in PIP payments than they could if they worked the legal maximum 12 hours at minimum wage. Harry, we start with you, if that's okay. It just feels, if you compare the two, that 16-year-old who's on benefits, who takes home £194, or is given, I should say, compared to the person who's working, you might understand why someone would think, why am I bothering?
Yes, indeed. I do think, obviously I accept that the PIP system is broken. There is no doubt about that. And the Stephen Timms review accepted it was broken. And we're going to get full recommendations for that later on this year. I do think it's possible that this headline is slightly naughty because it suggests somehow that there are a huge swathe of teenagers who are gaming the system. And of course, there are 1.5 million people in the UK who are age 16 or 17, and there are 87,000 of them on PIP, which is conceivably about 80,000 too many people on PIP of that age group. But that works out as about 6%. And then how many of them are on the upper tier? And that's the upper tier where you would, in theory, get more money. if you were working part-time, which seems a slightly strange comparison. We don't know how many are on the upper tier, but to be on the upper tier, you've got to tick all the boxes, be assessed by a health professional, proving you have serious mobility issues, as in you couldn't really get to work on your own, and as well as serious, living difficulties, as in you can't cut up food on your own. So I'm sure there are some teenagers who are gaming the system, but how many of them are on that upper tier and earning more money than working part-time? I'm not that sure, actually.
What we know is that more than 2/3 of those who are on that upper tier are claiming for developmental and neurodevelopmental conditions. So,
but the story is a bit, I am obviously very loyal Times writer, but the story's a bit naughty. Either the reporters know how many are on the upper tier, and it's actually an incredibly low number, or they don't know it's on the upper tier, but we need to find out how many are. Yes. I appreciate that those who are, yes, they are claiming mental health disabilities, and that is a very serious thing we need to get to the bottom of. Why, in the last 5 or 6 years, this has just shot up through the roof?
Yes, all we know is the percentage of those who are on the upper tier, but you are absolutely right, Harry, we don't know how many of them that is. The wider picture, Sienna, bring you in here, is actually that still is 87,000 16 and 17-year-olds claiming PIP. And what we learned from Alan Milburn's review, the first part of that's already been published. In the autumn, we get sort of some of the policy ideas about how to fix this, is that when you are on benefits, the earlier you are on benefits, the harder it is to ever come off them. So what the government have to do, and it looks like Andy Burnham does want to tackle this, is work out how to stop them getting on them in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that I would just make clear, in addition to Harry's points, is that obviously PIP is it can be an in-work benefit. So many of these people may be working alongside receiving PIP. So we have to always remember that. But yeah, I do think that there is an incentive problem. I think both our welfare system and the culture that we have now incentivizes people to say they're ill, and there is a problem with that. I think it feeds into the kind of, this is part of a broader picture of sort of generally the infantilisation of young people. They're living at home longer, they can't buy property, they're not having children, they're not forming long-term relationships. I mean, it's all going wrong for this generation. And there are so many factors that kind of feed into that. A major one, I think, being anyone who's read Jonathan Haidt will know, and Alan Milburn used this phrase himself in doing the review on NEETs, the anxious generation. I think a lot of it is to do with tech, and that has turbocharged our kind of culture of not just, we've gone past destigmatizing mental health issues a lot of the time and gone towards glamourising them. I think it's a real problem, and I noticed this at university where I and all of my friends, I've spoken about this before on Times Radio with Kate and Stig, were on medication for depression and anxiety. It was just the norm. And that kind of destigmatization was a good thing, but it hasn't actually done much for kind of more serious mental health problems. Because I know people, a paranoid schizophrenic, for example, in my family, who has a terrible time and hasn't been helped by this culture shift at all. So I think there are so many things to get into there, which Andy Burnham hopefully is actually going to start addressing, because it is difficult to talk about.
Sienna, I wonder if I could pick up on that cultural aspect that you were talking about. If we destigmatise, are we in danger of slightly fetishising certain conditions, not just pathologizing them, actually getting to a point where they become part of someone's identity, what makes them special and what makes them quite proud to have? And then, although that is something that people might be able to, or start to build a personality around, it's essentially destructive, because it's essentially something that stops people from being productive.
I do think that's right, and it's a really controversial thing to talk about, right? Because on the one hand, something very real is happening, which is that the conditions of modern life, the way that we live our lives, the way that young people are being treated in the jobs market as well, we have to not forget that, the way that they are, I mean, they're filing applications for jobs through AI and getting responses that are clearly crafted by AI as well. And the whole thing is just incredibly demoralizing, and they're all just despairing of the situation. at the same time as that very real thing that's happening, that's making this generation more anxious, it's also being glamorized, and it's now become a little bit of a fashion accessory, for example, to have a walking stick. This is something that I think older people don't quite realize. And also, yes, part of your identity to say, I have this list of conditions, it's, you know, it makes me a more interesting personality, and it's kind of an attractive thing to do now. And I think that really started with people my age, actually, and it was very much an online cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, I wonder how you combat that. I mean, Harry, you spend a lot of time talking to employers who are going to have to work out how to attract this generation. And it's not all of them, of course, but they are much more willing and able to talk about things that are going on at home, their mental health. Do you think the workforce is best equipped to hire that group of people?
Gosh, I mean, we know work does make, work is good for you. It does reduce all sorts of anxieties and mental health issues. It can improve your mental health outlook, that sense of, worth of going in and earning money. And it is obviously the moment you've been off work for, say, a year, I think that the statistics prove it is so much harder to get back into the workplace. You just get used to the idea that I don't work. I'm not in the workplace. And I think it starts earlier as well at school. And I think there's all sorts of, there is now such a huge swathe of people who now get a diagnosis. They're told it's healthy to get a diagnosis rather than just say, well, I've got to fit in. I might be slightly on the spectrum of autism or slightly on the spectrum of ADHD, but, I'm just going to get on with my life. And I think because so many people do get these diagnoses, you then get extra help at school. And, it can start in primary school. The amount, speak to any primary school teacher, and they're essentially social workers now, and they're helping so many kids with extra stuff. So it's just, you've gone through the entire school system expecting this extra help because of your diagnosis.
I wonder to what extent society has created this problem for itself. Yes, I understand that young persons' distress may be very real within their own heads, but that whole culture of bringing your authentic self to work. I don't want people's authentic self coming to work here at Times Radio. I want their best productive and most brilliant and civil self rather than their whole personalities. And yet that's what we are telling young people, that they should be able to live through whatever anxieties and problems that they're having, whether it's diagnoses of autism or ADHD or whether it's depression. And then these should be accommodated in some way in the workplace. I mean, that surely is counterproductive.
I think the backlash is starting. There was a very good book that came out actually only earlier this year, which is Don't Be Yourself. I've got it actually on my desk. Don't Be Yourself, Why Authenticity is Overrated. And it's essentially saying exactly to your point, Nick, that a successful company is all about teamwork, and it's about actually suppressing, in some cases, certainly your politics and some of the other things that you think are somehow relevant, your identity, certainly, so identity politics at work, because, a successful company is all about working together. And that's healthy. That's healthy to sometimes, to park, to leave some of your, your authenticity at home. Great at home, but come into work and let's all work together.
Yeah, great at the weekend. I'm sure our listeners will have some views on this. Please do send them in. 0333 003 2353 is the WhatsApp number. If I said that too quickly, it's on the times.radio website, or you can text us 87222. Start your text message with the word Times. Let's move on to our second subject today. The Times is reporting that 3 think tanks close to Labour are arguing for compulsory voting in this country, yet it isn't part of the current government's plans. It has already got rid of hereditary peers and is legislating for under 16s to vote. Should making people vote be next? Sienna, where do you stand on compulsory voting?
I have mixed views on it, but I am uncomfortable with compelled speech, and I would say that this is probably a form of compelled speech.
Well, go on.
And that. Well, I mean, we have restrictions on speech, don't we, in order to prevent harm and violence. And some of that is right. I mean, there are arguments over whether some of that legislation has gone too far. But in terms of compelled speech, actually forcing people to say a certain thing rather than stopping them from saying very obviously harmful things, I think that is far more problematic in a liberal society. So that's my main objection to it. I think then people might respond by saying, well, there are kind of carve out to certain things, and also you can have a none of the above option, but all those carve-outs for religious belief that they have in other places like Australia, for illness, for some countries have carve-outs for certain ages, etc. I think then you're just making the whole thing pointless.
We were talking about what sanction would be available to the authorities if you didn't vote and it was compulsory, and there was this talk of a £10 fine, which struck me as just a job creation scheme for debt collection agencies, and yet you are approaching it from a human rights perspective, that it would interfere with the Article 10 right to the freedom of expression, which I must admit I hadn't considered. Harry, what do you think of all this?
I'm completely with Sienna here. I think the joy of
you
British...
two are taking the high road, and I'm just thinking about bailiffs coming around trying to get their £10 fine.
Well, because our prisons, the idea that you might actually, which is in Australia, in the most strict circumstances, you can end up in jail. I mean, I think that's a very rare case. The idea that we should put people in prison for not voting seems outrageous. The joy of the British democracy is that you have the right to not vote, and in fact, we worry about low voter turnout, and it was below 60% at the last general election, but it's been above, it was nearly 70% only in 2017. When there are sort of key issues at stake and things are close, people get very exercised, people want to vote. And there was a really interesting, if you do it on a constituency by constituency basis, the really marginal ones were over 75% at the last election. So where Lib Dems gained from Conservatives, and for instance where Greens stood a chance of winning, those were really high turnouts. So I think the issue is possibly our first past the post system, not the idea that we have the freedom not to vote.
That came up as a suggestion earlier, actually. I think the bigger challenge, Sienna, is the people who aren't voting. That's 40% of those who are eligible have decided not to, or they couldn't come, or they were away and they hadn't got their poster vote sorted, whatever. But the majority of those, for them, they probably weren't interested. How do you incentivise people to want to vote without having to make it compulsory?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? I think it's just a really bad look for politicians to say, this isn't working, you're not inspired to vote, we're all out of options after having tried nothing, and therefore we'll make it compulsory. It's just a really bad impression to give, because I think people would, in the first place, like to say, well, perhaps you should kind of do your jobs and be, fostering a better political culture so that people are interested in voting and aren't so demoralised that they feel that there are no options or that politics isn't for them. I do also think that there's an interesting point about, I think historically and in other places, generally this has been a good thing for the left to make voting compulsory. I wonder whether that is still as true as it has been in the past. And we have the same kind of discussion around Vote 616. Generally that's regarded as, well, that would benefit the Labour Party, but increasingly we know that there's kind of this divergence between young men and women on politics and more interest in Reform UK from young people. So I wonder whether it would still be true, because Reform UK, obviously, much of their success has actually been built on getting historical non-voters to turn out, which is something that the Labour Party usually does to win its constituencies.
Yeah, and it also stresses, again, the importance of using social media and having different reach. A couple of your messages. Ian says, I oppose compulsory voting. Choosing not to vote itself is a democratic choice. It simply means voluntarily leaving the decision to those who care enough to participate.
Peter says, I'd be happy with compulsory voting as long as all ballot papers have a none of the above option. Otherwise, it gives the candidates a false legitimacy. And Charles has texted in to say, compulsory voting is a silly idea.
OK, there we go. Well, the government are not looking at it right now, but many think tanks that are influential in Labour circles are sort of petitioning a course of action that could look like that. And Andy Burnham has said he wants electoral reform. How far he will go, we don't yet know. Sienna and Harry, stay right there. We still need to talk about whether women should be in prison and where you might work to keep cool. This is Times Radio Breakfast with Rosie Wright and Nick Wallis. Reform UK's first elected Police and Crime Commissioner, Colin Sutton, has suggested women should be released from prison as a radical alternative to fix Britain's jail crisis. Sienna, is it a good idea?
For this question, you have to look at, why do we have prisons? Why do we send people to prison? I think there are four reasons. I'm going back to my criminal justice theory module that I did at university a long time ago. So the first is protect. Second is deterrence. Third, punishment, fourth rehabilitation. Now, those last two, punishment and rehabilitation, are the ones that are most contested, and people put an emphasis on one or the other, or some people think that punishment shouldn't be a factor at all, etc. I think clearly out of those four reasons, public protection has to be the priority, right? So I think that's where you start with this. Average custodial sentences for women are much shorter on average than for men. Most are for less than 6 months. Many are for example, theft from shops. They're not for violent crimes. Obviously, that cannot be treated on par with any kind of violent crime, certainly any sexual violent crime. So if you follow the logic of prioritizing risk to the public, I think you end up in a space where women are going to be freed before male prisoners generally. But I wouldn't put the emphasis on free women to solve the prison crisis. I just think it's probably the logical end point of the common sense way of approaching the whole issue.
Yeah, Harry, this issue is not going away. We have got more people being arrested. We've got people going to jail for longer amounts of time, and we are not building new prisons at the rate at which people are being criminalised. So does this need some sort of very creative, out-of-the-box thinking?
Well, there is a lot of creative thinking when it comes to women's prisons. Edwina Grosvenor, sort of the sister of the Duke of Westminster, runs a charity. She's quite a well-known prison reformer. She runs a charity called One Small Thing, and they have got a really interesting pilot program that's been going for quite a few years. It is being studied by academics, and I think the early signs are it has been very successful. It's called Hope Street. It's specifically for women who shouldn't be in prison but have been given custodial sentences. And various magistrates and judges do have the right to send these women to this facility. It's essentially a very nice residential facility. They get a job, they work in a cafe, and the key thing is children, because 60% of women who are sent to prison are mothers. The moment they get a custodial sentence, even only for 12 weeks, then their child is going to be taken almost certainly into care. So that's a second, third, fourth, fifth life completely disrupted and possibly ruined by the fact that someone, has been shoplifted, maybe they have a drug problem. More women end up in prison with drug problems than men. So when it comes to women, on the assumption it's not Mara Hindley, or Rose West, very, very, very small number of violent women. The rest, frankly, they shouldn't be in a traditional prison. There should be another solution.
Are we not creating a double standard, Harry? If I committed the same crime as Nick, we should have the same punishment.
That is a very good point, Rosie. But if this Hope Street pilot program is successful, there is no reason why something similar can't be done for men on a sort of, again, those low-level crimes that need proper rehabilitation. They need therapy. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound all touchy-feely, but a lot of this, you need therapy, not punishment.
But the difference there actually is about the type of crime that you committed rather than your gender.
Yes, but I think the key issue is that most women who end up in prison themselves have been victims of domestic violence. So I think when it comes to crime and punishment, it is, it does go along a lot on the sex and gendered line. So I think it is it's a good solution. I think it's worth looking at, and I think people should take a look at Hope Street and see the results when they come in, which I think might be next year.
Sienna, I wonder if Colin Sutton here isn't coming up with the wrong solution to a different problem. We can have an argument or a discussion about how many women should be making up the prison population, but not surely in order to solve prison overcrowding, because his argument sort of ran out of steam the moment I said, well, is this a one-off or is this going to be a regular thing where you reduce the sentences given to women? He said, it's just a one-off release. And so those prisons that you empty out to fill up with men, what happens when they then get filled up and you have to start dealing with women being given custodial sentences? It just doesn't really seem to wash that this is a viable alternative, much as we could and should have an important discussion about the number of women in prison in general.
Yeah, I think that's right. It has to be about the nature of the crime. I mean, the government is already working on sending fewer women to prison. They set up a women's justice board. It's something that Shabana Mahmood was very clear on, and I'm sure Alex Norris, as Justice Secretary, will be working on the same agenda. Obviously, I mean, you've brought up earlier in the programme the kind of practical problems with emptying women's prisons, and then the women who clearly do need to be at prison for public safety. reasons, then there are very few of them, and then what do we do about them going to mixed spaces, which would obviously be wrong. I think there will be an adjustment period whereby women would have to be maybe in prison very far from where their families are based, obviously, if you took this kind of approach. But obviously, in all of this, the priority has to be public safety. We have to think about, you can't think about deterrence at a time where there's a crisis because they're running at 97% capacity. You have to prioritise public protection. And yeah, that is going to lead to a lot of women being taken out of prison.
Very good point. Sienna, thank you. Now, just got time to squeeze in something that I know Harry's very keen to talk about, a new running club called Run to Wine. It does what it says on the tin. You run 5K and then you have wine and a nice charcuterie at the end. Is this something that would appeal to you, Harry?
Well, the idea of running anything more than about 3 miles sounds horrendous, but if I've got a glass of wine at the end, great. And I am a massive fan of this guy called Tom Gilby, or Ghibli, I can't quite remember his surname, but he ran the entire London Marathon. He's a wine merchant. On every single mile, he tasted a different glass of wine. It went viral a couple of years ago. It was so hugely impressive. So yes, I think you can. He proved you can run 26 miles after having had 26 quite small glasses of wine.
That is like the Marathon de Médoc that they run in France, where you can have, I think it is every mile.
I think if you're swilling it and sort of testing the palate and then spitting it out again, that sounds safe. It's Ghibli, by the way, I've been told by Emma, our genius producer, Harry. But I don't know. I just think the idea, as I say, I like a drink. I like doing exercise. The idea of mixing the two. I mean, would you go for a couple of pints after park run, Rosie?
That's very early, because that'd be about 9:30 in the morning.
That's the point, though, isn't it?
But what I think actually would be good about this, Sienna, I wonder, that generation you were talking about, I am a real advocate of doing activities with other people where you have to make yourself a little bit vulnerable or do something risky. For me, that might be singing in a choir. It could be quite embarrassing, singing out loud. Running with other people is something that is really bonding, because you do feel a bit like, oh, am I going to be able to keep up? You've had a shared experience with people, and then go for a drink. And we know the younger generation, they're actually drinking less. They're not socialising in the same way. They're much more inclined to stay at home. Sienna, I think this is probably a really good recipe for making new friends and building good relationships with them.
I'm not in favour of running.
There we go. Just cut the running
I don't
out.
support exercise, but drinking and smoking, which means being social and being outside, yes, all in favour of that.
But then you've had the shared experience. That's what I think is so good. You've had something to then bond over, and doing that over a glass of wine is probably easier.
I've never bonded with anyone over exercise. That just sounds horrific to me.
You've got to do park run. I'm so sorry to be so boring and being such an endless park run evangelist. That was the most difficult thing, honestly, in taking the weekend breakfast job at Times Radio. I thought, that is my final park run. And I had a park run.
You couldn't really make it a deal breaker, could you?
I had a park run finale party and everyone came. So sad, so tragic.
I'm just thinking about the cheese that they serve when after the run to 5K thing. Maybe it would mask certain other smells.
Oh, after 5K, and you could be a gentle jog. We're being told we've got to move on, which I think absolutely fair enough. Thank you both. Sienna Rodgers, Deputy Editor of the House Magazine, Harry Wallop, columnist at The Times. Thank you. Have a lovely day.